Well, good morning. My name is Art Athens, and on behalf of Admiral Ted Carter, the Superintendent of the Naval Academy, who's going to join us tomorrow morning, I'd like to welcome you to the 2015 McCain Conference. I have the honor of serving as the Director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, and our mission is to empower leaders to make courageous ethical decisions. And this conference is a main piece of accomplishing that mission on an annual basis. The conference's annual theme coincides with the research work done by the Stockdale Center resident fellows throughout the year, and we aim to bring together the best intellects in the military and civilian communities to address challenges in military ethics and leadership. We'll have 2 days of discussion, debate, and reflection on the topic teaching the just war tradition. Last year, we tackled comparative warfare ethics, and now we are turning our attention to our own shores and the shores of England and Australia as well, as we have representatives from those nations as well. And what we're going to do is explore our understanding of the just war tradition that guides our thinking about going to war and conducting ourselves in war, two crucial topics that are at the heart of our military thinking, and the pedagogy to present this material at all levels of our military education system. This conference is made possible through the generosity of Mrs. Cindy McCain, who established this conference in honor of her husband, Senator John McCain, USNA class of 1958. Additionally, we are grateful for the support provided for this conference by the Boeing Company, Mr. and Mrs. William Lavis, and Mr. and Mrs. Gary Sitzman. I also want to thank the Naval Academy class of 1958, the class of 1962, and Frank and Andrea Beam, Frank being from probably the most outstanding Naval Academy class of all time, the class of 1978, which I happen to be a part of. The classes of 1958 and 1962 and the Beams sponsor our resident fellows who engage with our topic throughout the year and help lay the foundation for this conference. I have two specific administrative notes to share before I introduce our first keynote speaker. The first is that there are restrooms located at both wings. If you continue along the concourse, you'll see men and women's restrooms that direction and that direction as well. And the second thing is there is Wi-Fi capability and the login information is located on the back side of your brochure. The center does take no responsibility for the password that was chosen by our Information Technology and Services Division, though we probably agree with what is said there. But we didn't set that password up on purpose. So I hope over these next 48 hours you will meet and interact with new colleagues and leave with a fresh perspective on the topic and ideas to impact your sphere of influence. If there's anything I or my staff can do, please let us know. To help begin the discussion and the debate and the reflection on our topic, I'd like to introduce this morning's keynote and kickoff speaker, Dr. James Turner Johson. Dr. Johson is Distinguished Professor of Religion and Associate of the Graduate Program in Political Science at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. His research and teaching have focused principally on the historical development and application of the Western and Islamic moral traditions related to war, peace, and the practice of statecraft. Dr. Johson is a prolific author, and his influential books include Ideology, Reason, and the Limitation of War, Can Modern War Be Just?, The Holy War Idea in Western and Islamic Tradition, and Ethics and the Use of Force, Just War and Historical Perspective. His most recent book, Sovereignty, Moral and Historical Perspectives, was published by Georgetown University Press in the spring of 2014, and a co-edited book, The Ashgate Research Companion to Military Ethics, was published recently in February of 2015. Dr. Johson is a trustee, editorial board member, and former general editor of the Journal of Religious Ethics, founding co-editor of the Journal of Military Ethics, and a member of professional societies in the field of religion and political science. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Johson this morning to begin our McCain Conference. Please join me in giving Dr. Johson a warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Art. It's a very great pleasure for me to be back, and I hope I'll get a chance to talk with all of you at some point in the next day or so. While Art and Ed are still around, I have a little presentation to make before beginning my talk. Years ago, when the Ethics Center here was just founded and not yet named after Admiral Stockdale, Al Pierce was serving as the initial director, and he happened to mention to me, he and I are friends, happened to mention to me that they were starting a library for the center. So on my next trip down, I brought a copy of all of my books up to that point and donated them to the library. Well, that's been some years, and as Art was just saying, I've managed to keep some other things coming out. And so I brought along not just 2, but 3 books that I'm donating to the library. Ethics in the Use of Force, which was published in 2011. The Sovereignty book that you mentioned, which was published in 2013. And the Ashgate Research Companion to Military Ethics, which I edited with Eric Patterson, which was just published this past winter. And so I hereby give you the book.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
And if anyone is perhaps interested in this last book, the Ashgate book, you know, Ashgate books tend to be rather pricey, but I have a flyer in my file that I will happily give to anyone that's interested in buying it, and you get it for half price. So keep that in mind. Just see me if you think you might be interested. There are several authors of chapters in this volume who are presenters at this conference, and so you might want to chat them up a little bit as well. On to the business at hand. Getting it right. Changes in just war thought on sovereignty, just cause, and right intention from the classic just war idea until today. If one were to survey the field of contemporary writing on just war, one might easily be confused as to exactly what constitutes the idea of a just war, or might wonder if just war means anything at all other than what the individual authors want it to mean. To take simply a sample from my own shelf, recent books on just war by Alex Bellamy, Davis Brown, Darrell Charles, Robert Phillips, Mark Totten, Albert Weeks, and Craig White all define just war by listing a set of criteria for the decision to go to war and for conduct during war. That is what we now call the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello. Brown's and Totten's listings are essentially what I would give if I were asked for such a list, beginning with the classic requirements of sovereign authority, just cause, and right intention. And that idea of right intention would include the end of peace. And then moving on to several prudential criteria that are widely applied today. Reasonable hope of success, proportionality of ends, and lack of reasonable alternatives, that is, last resort. And finally, defining right conduct in war in terms of the principles of discrimination and proportionality of means. Though in my own work, I really prefer the older way of doing it that is maintained in the law of armed conflict, that is identifying particular classes of non-combatants and identifying weapons that are not to be used because of their disproportionate effects. White offers a list with the same headings and in the same order, but in his case, it's limited to the war decision categories only, because his purpose in his book is to argue the injustice of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And that purpose also heavily influences how he defines the particular categories. Furthermore, he uses these categories as a backwards-looking checklist to criticize that war, not the way that I would insist is the right way, as a forward-looking basis for moral reflection on violence and on whether to employ military force in a particular crisis and how to use it if it is employed. This latter approach, not the backwards-looking checklist employed to bolster political argumentation, is what I think the idea of just war is about. All the other authors that I mentioned shift the order and priority of the criteria named, or combine some of them, or simply don't mention some. Charles and Weeks both begin with just cause, not sovereign authority. Phillips starts out with the last resort. Bellamy begins with right intention. Just cause is also the first criterion listed in the definition of just war given by the U.S. Catholic bishops in their widely influential 1983 pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, and in subsequent statements from them. Where each of these listings begins, telegraphs the author's position on what is most important or most fundamental to that author. 7 of the recent authors, as well as the Catholic bishops, don't mention the end of peace at all as a moral criterion in the decision to use military force, perhaps reflecting a widespread contemporary view that war and peace are not interrelated, but are mutually exclusive. All the authors include right authority as a requirement for just war, though many of them put it well below just cause in priority, and sometimes define it in legal or political terms simply as legitimate or as competent authority. Describing right conduct in the use of military force by reference to the principles of discrimination and proportionality is universal among these examples, and also familiar in wider recent discussion of just war. And it is migrated into the law of war or international humanitarian law, where discrimination appears as the principle of distinction, and proportionality is also there in the same use of the same term. Both the ethicists and the lawyers use the term proportionality, though there's wide variation among the sources as to how to calculate this. And for some of the authors, it simply means whatever they seem to consider to be disproportionate, which isn't exactly how a mathematician would want to define proportionality. In any case, these two terms, discrimination and proportionality, are relatively recent, having been introduced into just war thinking by Paul Ramsey back in the 1960s. If one looks for a bit more order in recent work on just war than the disparate examples that I've just talked about, then it's useful to think further about Ramsey and his influence, that of Michael Walzer a decade later, and that of the U.S. Catholic bishops a few years after Walzer. Though the just war idea is centuries old and can be argued to represent, as one author has put it, the way we in the West think ethically about war, it effectively disappeared from critical ethical reflection on war from roughly the middle of the 17th century until the last 50 years. The work on just war of Ramsey, Walzer, and the Catholic bishops stand as important benchmarks in the recovery of just war thinking that has taken place in the last half century. Yet none of them tried to recover the earlier conception, the earlier historical idea of just war, either how it was defined, the impact it had, or how it was used. Rather, each of these three benchmark figures reinvented the just war idea anew, giving it a particular stamp in each case, and their successors have largely followed the model that they set out. The differences among subsequent writers on just war trace back in different ways to the influence of these different benchmark reinventions of the idea of just war. Ramsey, a Christian ethicist, has had a particular impact on just war writers seeking to explore the ethics of war and military force from a Christian normative standpoint. The recent book by Nigel Bigger, the Oxford theologian, a book called In Defense of War, stands importantly in this tradition of ethical reflection. Ramsey's influence can also be seen in The Challenge of Peace and in later authors like Darrell Charles, whom I mentioned earlier, though how his influence is put to use in these sources is rather different from how Ramsey himself developed his thinking, and sometimes completely at odds with it. For example, the argument of the Catholic bishops that contemporary warfare is almost always unjust, nuclear war always so, because the criteria of discrimination and proportionality cannot be met. This never appears anywhere in Ramsey. In fact, what Ramsey was trying to do was to think about how we could, in fact, conduct modern war morally. The same disconnects can be noted in the influence of Walzer. When Anglo-American philosophers discovered the idea of just war, they presented it in Walzer's terms, and they really haven't looked further. But philosophers writing on just war have not sought to draw out Walzer's thinking as a whole. Rather, they have picked up one or another theme or specific idea from it and developed their own discourse centered on analyzing that theme or idea and drawing its meaning out to their own ends. One prominent example of this is David Rodin's use of the human rights idea, prominent in Walzer's thought on war, to argue for the injustice of any contemporary war, except one authorized by a universal state with, as Rodin puts it, a world monopoly of military force, together with a minimal judicial mechanism for the resolution of international and internal disputes. Another example from contemporary philosophy is my Rutgers colleague Jeff McMahan's critique of what Walzer calls the moral equality of soldiers, with McMahan arguing that there is no such moral equality. For McMahan, only soldiers in a just war have the moral right to fight, and without a just cause, soldiers are in effect war criminals. These authors work to conclusions that are very different from anything Walzer himself has ever said. Walzer has commented that the philosophers' discussions of just war have become less about war and more about philosophy. Of course, self-referentialism is typical of academic disciplines, and it has its value. But the big picture tends to get lost in it, and the subject tends to become just a case to be argued about. The just war conception of the U.S. Catholic bishops has a special place in the evolution of recent thinking on just war because far more than the work of the two academics, Ramsey and Walzer, and that of other academic writers also working on the just war from a perspective more shaped by history, including William O'Brien of Georgetown and me, the debate centered on the production and publication of The Challenge of Peace succeeded in drawing significant attention in military and political circles and among a broader public. It has also had significant long-term effect, so that it deserves a closer look. Fundamentally, this effect has been to shift the meaning of the just war idea to make it about limiting the possibility of resort to war, whatever the cause might be. The impulse that originally led to this pastoral letter came from Catholic opponents to war generally and nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war in particular. In the context of the buildup of U.S. nuclear capability under the Reagan administration, in response to the perceived missile gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, members of the U.S. National Conference of Catholic Bishops, who were personally anti-war and anti-nuclear, urged the Conference of Bishops to issue a statement condemning nuclear weapons and nuclear war. Their influence reached a high watermark in the language of the second draft of the pastoral letter, which took an unyielding position against nuclear weapons and war in general. This draft, when it appeared, received unprecedented publicity for a second draft of anything, appearing in full in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, with extensive accompanying stories. Many in government and the military were deeply worried about the position taken in this draft, fearing that if the Catholic bishops adopted such a position as a matter of collective policy, Catholics then serving in government and the military, who had responsibilities within the system of nuclear deterrence, would not be able to be trusted to carry out their responsibilities. But the second draft of the pastoral did not survive because of criticism within the Conference of Bishops as well as from outside. And the challenge of peace, as it finally was issued, was based on a third, quite different draft that presented Catholic moral teaching on war as including two traditions, a pacifist rejection of all war and the tradition of just war, which were described as linked and ultimately expressing different perspectives on a single basic idea, a moral presumption against war. But in fact, such an idea had never appeared in classic just war thought, or even in Catholic thought as maintained in the canon law up through 1918. The conception that appeared in Catholic canon law was that the aim of just war is to prevent and remedy injustice, and the use of armed force may be justified in certain cases for this purpose. In any case, within the moral frame established by the anti-war presumption, the bishops defined the idea of just war as being an effort to prevent war, that's their term, by establishing a set of rigorous conditions, 7, in fact, as they listed them, from the jus ad bellum, and 2 for the jus in bello, all of which must be unambiguously individually met for a war to be morally permissible. The criteria named by the bishops included classic ones, just cause, which they called, just cause, which they basically defined in terms of the UN Charter, what was here called competent authority, and right intention, though they defined all of these in new ways. But they also introduced several new ideas: comparative justice, last resort, probability of success, overall proportionality. Though a theoretical resort to war is possible on their thinking, in practice, spokesmen for the bishops have, through arguments favoring the new prudential criteria, repeatedly argued against resort for war, even in the debate over the use of force to undo Iraq's invasion and takeover of Kuwait in 1990-91. One critic has called the position taken in the challenge of peace and subsequent statements a functional pacifism. And it's important to keep in mind that this conception of just war was described by the bishops themselves as an effort to prevent war. Excuse me. I have a thing with coffee that makes me hoarse, and unfortunately I had a second cup this morning, which I should not have done. I have dwelt in some detail on the U.S. Oh, thank you. That may help. Let me try that. I've dwelt in some, yes, it helped, detail on the U.S. Catholic bishops' conception of just war, not only because it defines the third major stream in recent just war thinking, alongside those coming out of Ramsey's and Walzer's work, but because for many the very idea of a just war is a Catholic idea, so that what the U.S. bishops say it must be right. Their list of the just war criteria has accordingly spread broadly in secular just war thinking, and so has the interpretation of the criteria in ways aimed at limiting sharply any justified right to use armed force or perhaps to deny it entirely. Thus, to recall the list of recent authors of books on just war that I mentioned earlier, Charles, Weeks, and Phillips all present lists of just war criteria that closely match the list given by the bishops, and Charles and Weeks quite also go out of their way to stress, like the bishops, that each and every one of the listed criteria must be unambiguously individually satisfied for a just resort to armed force. The result is a conception of just war that is fundamentally oriented towards preventing resort to war, whatever the circumstances. In line with this aim, the Vatican now has an office, I learned just recently, an office of jus contra bellum, a recently constructed Latin term having to do with moral reasons against war in all cases. So they now have an office of jus ad bellum, an office of jus in bello, and an office of jus contra bellum. And there is a proposal for what would I think be a good move, an office of jus post bellum. But I'm fascinated by the jus contra bellum office. I have a good deal of respect for Ramsey's and Walzer's lines of reasoning, though they each have their own limits and are very different from the classic conception of just war that I believe needs to be kept in central focus. But I regard the conception of just war put forward and defended by the U.S. Catholic bishops as fundamentally mistaken. The major good it did, when it appeared, was to bring the just war into a broader debate, including within policy and military circles. Yet its conception of the just war idea itself and how it is to be used is, I think, way off target. So how should we act to try to get the matter of just war right as a source for ethical reflection and action, looking forward to the possibility of war and trying to find ways by which a justified use of force can serve our own security and that of the world, seeking to rectify injustices and create conditions for peace? My answer is that these aims are best served by thoroughly understanding the idea of just war as it originally came together in its classic form and endured as a cultural consensus for several centuries. That conception focused not on avoiding violence as such, but on the responsibility of good government to fight injustice by seeking to rectify it and to punish wrongdoing, all to the good of each political community and the collective good of all political communities, understood as inseparably linked, so that the harm done to to the good of one of them becomes harm to the good of all. That classic conception of just war was a reflection of Western culture in a broad sense. It incorporated engaged reflection on law, religion, human rights, the natural order of things, and both political and military experience. It began to come together in the work of a canon lawyer, a man named Gratian, in the middle of the 12th century, was developed and refined by two generations of canonist successors over a bit more than a century after that, and is best known today through the summary account of it given by a theologian, Thomas Aquinas, in his major work, the Summa Theologiae, produced 3/4 of the way through the 13th century. In that account, which focuses on the decision whether to use force to rectify injustice and serve general peace, 3 requisites for a just war, a bellum justum, are defined: sovereign authority, the authority of a temporal ruler with no temporal superior over the political community for which that sovereign has responsibility. Second, just cause, defined as setting right injustice and punishing those responsible for the injustice. And thirdly, right intention, which is defined negatively as the avoidance of specific wrong intentions that were originally listed by Augustine, incidentally, but positively as the intention to reestablish peace by restoring a just order. This conception of just war, sovereign authority, just cause, right intention, including the end of peace, this conception of just war stands as the classic statement of the just war idea. Though described here in the work of a theologian, it reflected a broad cultural consensus, and it held as a norm for over 300 more years after Aquinas. An impressive track record, I suggest. Again, this conception of just war focused on the decision to use armed force, what would today be called the jus ad bellum, though that term didn't in fact appear until several centuries later, when it appeared as a legal term, not a moral one, and referred in context to the formal obligation of a state when moving to the legal status of being at war. We obviously use the term far more broadly these days. Aquinas' account didn't specifically treat the matter of right conduct in the use of armed force because it didn't fit the context in which he was writing. But the canon law by his time already included significant statements on this. A definition of non-combatant immunity by means of listings of certain categories of people who normally were not directly engaged in war and thus shouldn't have war directed at them, and a list of certain weapons not to be used in war because their effects were inherently indiscriminate and disproportionate. Separately, the Code of Chivalry was also developing its own rules for right conduct in war, the loi d'armes, or in Latin, the jus in bello. Later on in the period of the 100 Years' War, these two approaches, the canonical one and the chivalric one, came together and were added to the conception of just war that had been succinctly defined by Aquinas. This consolidated conception of just war was then the one that carried forward into the modern period, where it was gradually reshaped ultimately into a theory of the law of nations. Within this latter frame, the essentially moral idea of just war fell out of fashion, being replaced by the idea of legal or regular war, war according to the rules or the laws and customs of war, accepted consensually by nations in their interactions. We need to look a bit more closely at the meaning of the classic statement of just war as summarized by Aquinas' three conditions. First, just war had to do with bellum, a term we translate as war, but which in the medieval context referred to the organized collective use of armed force on behalf of the political community for the good of that community under the authority of a person with governing responsibility over that community. Any other use of armed force was duellum, which gives us our word duel. In context, this term referred to uses of force, whether by individuals or by groups, that were not for the public good, but for private gains or to settle private quarrels. While duellum was common for members of the knightly class through much of the Middle Ages, one reason for the emergence of the idea of bellum justum, just war, was to attempt to root bellum out as destructive of peace, order, and justice in the public sphere. Aquinas' terminology reflects this. His first necessity for a just war was the authority of a prince, which meant the authority of a temporal ruler with no temporal superior. A ruler of this sort, by this time, was also being referred to in French as souverain, our English sovereign. So Aquinas' auctoritas principis, the authority of a prince, could also be rendered as sovereign authority, as I have done it. Such a person, the sovereign ruler, was within his, or sometimes her, or even their own political community, the person, or sometimes persons, with final responsibility for the good of that community, its order, its justice, and its peace in the language of the time. Everyone else within that community, besides the sovereign, could in principle and should in practice refer any disputes upwards to his or her superiors, and any disputes not resolved at a lower level were ultimately the responsibility of the prince, the sovereign, to resolve. This way of thinking delegitimized duellum as a means of settling disputes, restricting the right of the use of armed force to the sovereign. But the sovereign's responsibility for the good of the whole community meant that he or she, or as I say, sometimes they, was responsible for rectifying any violation of justice within that community. For any violation of justice inherently affected the community's overall order and its internal peace. It wasn't just random, then, that Aquinas listed the authority of a prince or sovereign authority first among his three necessary conditions for a bellum justum, a just war. For the sovereign was the one person having the responsibility, understood as given him or her or them in the natural law, to rectify any injustice that might threaten the good of the community, to determine whether doing so would require armed force or not, and to act to reestablish a just order, all to the end of the community's peace. The other two conditions that Aquinas named as necessary for a bellum justum, just cause and right intention, were further specifications of the sovereign's moral responsibility. Just cause was defined as restoring that which had been wrongly taken, that is, rectifying the injustice at issue, and punishment of the wrongdoer. For unlike much present-day thinking, according to which any punishment of any sort is inherently vindictive, punishment in the Middle Ages was understood as necessary to restore the balance of justice. Right intention, in turn, Aquinas defined, as I noted, in two ways. First, he cited a well-known passage from Augustine listing wrongful personal intentions that had no place in the use of force to correct a wrong. The desire for harming, the cruelty of avenging, an unruly and implacable animosity, the rage of rebellion, the lust of domination, and the like. These bore specifically on the internal moral disposition of the ruler and those who fought under the ruler's authority. Response to a threat to the community was a moral responsibility, after all, and it could not be undertaken by persons with immoral dispositions. So this was one dimension of the requirement of right intention. But a few paragraphs later, Aquinas listed a broader aim, the end of peace, distinguishing uses of armed force in the service of this end from uses of force motivated by other intentions. The latter might technically be cases of bellum, collective uses of armed force on public authority, but they could not be bellum justum, just uses of armed force, unless they were intended to serve the end of peace. The outcome of all of this was to define the idea of just war in a form that remained normative through the rest of the Middle Ages and well into the modern period, and which still remains as the classic statement of just war, setting a standard which I believe any subsequent effort ought to pay attention to as we seek to draw out the meaning of just war. There are subtle interrelationships of ideas in this classic statement, and it's perhaps not surprising, though no less inexcusable, that most recent writing that claims to be about just war has missed them entirely. First, the responsibility for authorizing use of armed force is recognized in the classic version as belonging to the person or persons at the top of the pyramid of political authority in a given political community, because only such a person has final responsibility for the good of that community. This is why Aquinas, in agreement with the canonical tradition before him, put the authority of a prince first among his requirements for just war. And its importance is entirely missed in those present-day lists of the just war criteria that begin with just cause and demote what is termed competent or legitimate authority to some subordinate position. This is perhaps understandable, though Augustine, with his sharp eye for the effects of sin and self-interest, would have certainly raised an eyebrow, or maybe two, putting just cause first, for, after all, over the authority criterion, puts the right to determine just cause in the hands of the moralist, the individual writer on just war, or the U.S. Catholic bishops, despite the fact that such people do not, in fact, bear the responsibility of seeking to ensure the public good of the political community. The classic conception of just war, I think, got it right. Moving on, the classic conception of just cause, as summarized in Aquinas' list of the necessities for a just use of armed force, is defined in terms of restoring justice where there has been injustice and punishing those responsible for the injustice. Restricting a political community's right to resort to force to cases of self-defense, as provided in the UN Charter and in much recent just war theorizing, was not part of the classic statement of just war, because at the time the right of self-defense against an attack immediately threatened or in progress was understood as given by the natural law to anybody and everybody, and thus it needed no further authorization. But once the moment of the attack had passed, things changed. Rectifying the injustice it had left in its wake was then no longer a matter for private judgment. That would be the grounds for a feud. It became rather a responsibility for a sovereign. So it is not that the classic understanding of just war didn't provide for the defense of the community in face of the threat of an actual attack. It was just that the obligation of doing so was assumed. The focus then shifted to how to restore the justice that had been violated by the threat or the attack, and that's really what classic just war thought specifically to address. I think we should be deeply concerned for moral reasons about contemporary versions of just war thinking that have as their aim avoiding any resort to violence, for then injustice stands, and those responsible are left with the power to go on unopposed. Again, the classic conception of just war, I think, got it right. Finally, what of right intention? The third classic requirement for a just war. The wrong intentions identified by Augustine and preserved in the classic account of just war and restated by Gratian and his successors and by Aquinas remind us that the political leaders are charged with rising above their own personal motivations when considering whether to use armed force in the service of the community as a whole. Applied to warriors, it also serves as a reminder that individual warriors, however much they may feel the loss of a comrade and have come to hate the enemy, have the responsibility to rise above that, for they're not given the right to kill and destroy because of their own personal hurts, but rather to protect, defend, and uphold the good of the community they serve. The reality, of course, is that these dimensions of hurt are part of the experience of every person who has been in combat, and they are not to be denied. My point is rather that the classic idea of just war reminds us that revenge for these hurts does not represent the final moral purpose of taking part in combat. In the very different moral and religious climate of the Middle Ages, for about a century there was a canonical requirement that soldiers returning from combat confess any wrongful intentions they had had, do penance for those intentions, and only then receive absolution and be readmitted to the life of the church. This was, we might reasonably say, a way of seeking to deal with the reality of combat and PTSD. In the just war frame, it also served to remind returning warriors that what they did in combat, they did on the authority of others and in the service of the good of the community as a whole. This problem has generally been neglected in recent writing on just war. It would be good, I think, if we sought to do more with it. But the second dimension of right intention is the end of peace. This is all too often, as I've noted, omitted in recent lists of the just war criteria. It's not there either in Ramsey or in Walzer. The Catholic bishops, not in their first statement, but in their second one, 10 years later, reduced the idea of peace to an element in the jus in bello, removing it entirely from the moral intentionality that needs to be present in the decision to use armed force in a particular context. This fits the way the states of war and peace are handled by the bishops and also the way they're handled in international law. War and peace there are separate and distinct. Peace ceases to exist when war begins, and it comes back into being when war ends. In the frame of moral argument that begins with opposition to war as evil in itself, there is no place for peace in the conception of war. But again, I think the classic conception of just war got it right. For peace means much more than the absence of war. And we need to have a way of thinking morally about war that recognizes when it is essential to the service of peace. Overall, I've been arguing that the classic conception of just war got the fundamentals right in its moral definition of sovereign authority, just cause, and right intention. And I think contemporary just war reasoning needs to pay a great deal more attention to that classic statement of the idea of just war. I myself have been particularly drawn to it in recent years because of what it says on how to think about political responsibility and service to the public good. That's why I wrote the sovereignty book. But the theorists who worked to define and interpret the classic conception of just war so many years ago worked within very different historical frames from one another and from us. And the point should always be how to understand what and how those thinkers were about in their own contexts, and then how today we might best, in the context of our own historical frame, think of the responsibilities of political leaders and the communities they serve, as well as warriors and the communities that they serve, in seeking to ensure the good of their neighbors and their own political community and in the world at large. Getting it right is a perennial challenge that we should all seek to meet, and enrolling the wisdom of history helps towards meeting that challenge successfully. Thank you.
Sir, you take any questions here?
Oh, sure.
We have some time for questions, so if you just want to raise your hand, Dr. Johnson will recognize you, and please ask your question.
Martin, Jim, two questions. You know, I've read almost everything you've written, so I have the benefit of that. The modern just war tradition in the legal form is really defined from 1928 on, from the Telegraph Act, as defining anything that's not a response to aggression as an illegitimate war. Whereas the medieval tradition clearly understood redressing wrongs of various sorts or trying to rectify evils as a legitimate cause of war. If I understand you correctly, you're really arguing we should retrieve that idea, that we're being excessively restrictive in thinking that the only legitimate wars are those that respond to aggression. This goes well beyond what Catholic bishops' quasi-pacifism goes. So would you, if you were God, would you want to do the UN Charter? Would you want to do the Telegraph Act? Would you re-legitimize other things like that? And then the second question is, the Augustinian concern about sin and about making one's own judgments about this is granting a permission to redress evils that have already occurred to individual sovereign authorities, which seems to me to be a recipe for allowing self-serving and interpretations of what constitutes a wrong you want to redress.
Well, Martin, you may have read most of what I've written, but you clearly have not yet read the sovereignty book, so put that under this. I talk about that in there.
Dr. Johnson, you want to go behind the mic?
Oh, sorry. I was trying to be informal, but obviously I need to be audible rather than informal. I suggested to Martin that he needed to read my sovereignty book because I deal with those issues there. I I would note that the lawyers don't go back to Kellogg-Briand. They go back to the UN Charter, to Article 2.4 and Chapter 7, when they're talking about the right to use force or not use it. And so I tend to go from that. And also, I think that the moralists who adopt defense as the only just cause probably don't know much about Kellogg-Briand, but they have heard that there is something called the UN Charter and so forth. So that's where they tend to begin. But certainly, you're right, the idea goes back to 1928 and the Peace of Paris, or the Treaty of Paris. But this was a conception that, in its own context, made a great deal of sense. It was the effort to avoid a recurrence of the carnage of World War I. It was an effort to redress what had come to be known as the use ad, let's see, what is it? Well, I've forgotten the Latin. I can't get it into the Latin. But there was a term that began to be used by the lawyers in the 19th century that referred to the sovereign's inalienable right to start a war. And so the Kellogg-Briand Pact was an attempt to say, no, that no longer holds. And the Charter, I think, rightly after World War II, picked up on this. What I would argue, and what I did argue in the sovereignty book, is that this was good, but some things got lost. And one of the things that got lost was the idea that the sovereign is not simply the guy in charge, but the guy who is responsible for the good of the community. That is, the older idea gives us purchase on the problems that the responsibility to protect seeks to deal with, that you do not actually get out of the version of the restrictions on the use of force that comes out of the Charter. I know that the 2005 World Summit Outcome document tries very hard in its statement on R2P to say, well, it's already all there in the Charter, but it's not in fact there. So it needs to be, we need to be aware that there is an earlier idea of sovereignty that does encompass moral responsibility. Now, the second point you raise is a tricky one, because throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, so long as there was a moral consensus in Western Europe, there was a self-policing aspect to this conception of sovereignty, because the right to exercise the right to use armed force as an instrument of upholding responsibility for the good of the political community was understood as given in the natural law. And the natural law was pretty much consensual. So everybody could agree that that's what it meant, and it didn't give you the right to be a tyrant. So you get this whole literature coming out of the Middle Ages and going up into the modern period on tyranny and the resistance to tyranny. So there was the sovereign, who was the legitimate prince, and then there was the tyrant, who was the illegitimate prince. And you didn't want the latter to happen. And if it did happen, then there was a lot of discussion on how such a person could be removed. And one of the ways was, not the preferable way, but one of the ways was for the neighboring sovereign to come in and help the locals do so. But this broke apart in the early modern period, first because of the Spanish encounter with the Indians in the New World and the discovery that they didn't know anything at all about natural law as the Europeans considered it. And secondly, as a result of the break in Christianity that occurred from after the Protestant Reformation. And so you did then begin to have this phenomenon that you're talking about, where individual sovereigns acting for what they claim to be their own interpretation of their responsibilities exercise the right to use armed force. And so I have a good deal of discussion about that in the book, and warn us that we have to be alert to that. And so in the end, what I'm looking for is not a total overthrow of either of these two ideas of sovereignty, but some serious theoretical effort at blending the two so that it gives us a better conception than either of the two is by itself. But read the book. Even though I don't have a half-price coupon for it. Yes?
Sir, Jonathan Shaw, thank you for your fine paper. On the moral consensus of the community, the natural law effect of them taking up arms for violence. It was very, St. Augustine would regularly preach in the late 390s in northern Africa to congregations that if they did not take up arms, as the hordes were now closing in on their communities, that it would do them no good to say, well, I love my brother and therefore I can't do so. But rather, the very love and living in the community required them to take up arms. So he tried to head off any kind of pacifist understanding of faith.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that those hordes that you refer to were in fact all Christians, but they were Arian Christians, not Catholic Christians. And so what Augustine was arguing for here was war to protect the true faith as he understood it against aggressors. And it turns out that was the weak place in the resolution of the first of the wars of religion, the Germanic wars of religion, the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, which says the prince gets to decide the religion of the Commonwealth. The problem then was, well, what about those who are not of that religion? Do they have any rights? And if they were to be regarded as having rights, then a neighboring prince might take up arms to help them to protect themselves against what was seen as aggression by their own tyranny by their own prince. And that's where the older idea of sovereignty came apart. Yeah, Augustine he wasn't alone in reversing the anti-war attitudes to be found in the first 3 or 4 centuries. There were others earlier than him that took basically the same position he took, although they didn't spell it out as well. I remember Augustine's mentor Ambrose, and on the duties of the clergy with that memorable phrase, "He who does not keep arm off a friend when he can is as guilty as him who causes it." Anyway, what Augustine did that is often not realized very well by people who have only read City of God 19 was to come to terms with the fact that even though the Roman Empire was not a just society by his terms, it nonetheless had done a lot of good, and its demise would bring a lot worse for everybody. That's an important political insight. You don't have to have a perfect society in order to try to uphold justice for the mass of people. And that, I think, is what Augustine was trying to do. Yes, Rebecca.
Rebecca Johnson, Rutgers University. So the theme of this conference is teaching the just war tradition, or teaching Western just war tradition. What recommendations do you have for faculty to reach students who either aren't interested in history, aren't necessarily interested in the just war tradition? How can we take this information and make it engaging?
Well, I think that some acknowledgement of the history needs to be there, but I don't think that that's where the focus needs to be. I think that that drawing out the implications of responsibility for the good of one's community and for the international good is where I would want to put the focus. I think that I would want to put the focus on finding a way to deal with injustice without creating more injustice. And sometimes that would involve the use of force, but sometimes it might not. The anti-violence people say that violence always makes more harm than good. I'm not sure that would hold up to close scrutiny. And when one thinks about the whole matter of intentionality, the reason that I said what I did about the medieval practice of requiring confession and penance after combat as a way of coming to terms with the bad memories that one has. That's to remind us that this is a problem that we need to be thinking about in advance as well as afterwards, and that commanders or future commanders need to be thinking about as they lead people in combat.
Jeff Suss from the National Defense University. I'll say it up front, I haven't read your book. But a lot of us are teaching at the level where they're talking about use of smart power and other government ways of regulating the peace and international affairs. And how do you see just war theory approaching that, particularly in the sense of embargoes, other ways we exert force on nations that tip the balance of justice without armed conflict?
One of the problems, I think, in a lot of the moral discourse is that these are presented as alternatives. If you do the smart power, if you do the embargoes, if you do the sanctions right, if you do the diplomacy right, then we can put away our guns. I think that's overlooking a great deal about human nature and about the way politics actually works. What we need to do is to remember that the idea of just war does not have to do simply with justifying the use of armed force. It has to do with figuring out when the use of armed force is appropriate for dealing with the particular injustice at hand. So that's where I put the focus. Is that it?
Thank you very much, sir, for spending time and for your long tradition of helping people think through this important issue. And we have a small token of our appreciation from the center. And if we could give Dr. Johnson a hand, please.